Welcome to Straight Talk Live. My name is Rick Snyder, one of the co-hosts of this fantastic show, our last show of the year. And yes, we are going to kick back up after the holidays. But just want to thank you all for tuning in this year. It's been an amazing launch of this podcast, which really started around COVID. And my co-host Af and I not being satisfied by the conversations that we were hearing in the mainstream and in the media, and how unprepared we all are around human, digital, and social transformation. And just that's what really was the impetus of this show. And so I just want to especially thank each of you who've been along the ride with us, who've also shared that interest in knowing that these conversations are sparking other conversations in your lives, whether it's around the unemployment crisis or education or sustainability and climate, or how to find the courage to be an outlier in the corporate world, like we're going to get into today. But first, I want to introduce my co-pilot, Af Malhotra. Af, take it away.
Thank you very much, sir. Welcome, everyone, to yet another fantastic episode of Straight Talk Live. I'm, of course, the co-host and also the co-founder of Growth Enabler. And I'm extremely excited about today, in particular, because this individual who we're going to introduce in a minute, she's one of those executives and people that I don't know how do I put this. It's the first time I met Rick. It felt like I've known him for ages. He called it the soul connection, and I feel after I met Lisa just a few months ago, in fact, we've had a few very powerful conversations. She's got such an incredible energy, very sort of compelling experience in the executive world that I'm sure she'll tell you about. And what drew my attention to the topic today was how I was just inspired by the fact that she had the courage, she has the courage, and she just turned up the dial, I guess, to step out of the corporate for a period of time and has transformed her mindset and her thinking to the extent that she's gone back into the corporate. So she's ready to go back into battle again, and is now creating change at an unprecedented rate. And hats off to you. I didn't have the courage to go back into the corporate. So that was inspirational for me. So Rick, over to you to do the formal intro, and then let's crack on.
Okay. So Lisa, first of all, welcome to Straight Talk Live. And Lisa is, excited to have you here. And Lisa is the Chief Strategic Financial Officer at Farmers Insurance. And Lisa, for those in our audience who may not have been exposed to you yet, which they will after this show for sure, can you let them know a little bit about your background? That would be helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for having me. It's just going to be such a treat to have this conversation with the two of you. I'm very excited. So yeah, I always like to less about my background and my corporate, and I'll touch on my experience in a moment, but I would say I'm defined actually by my by the kind of oddity of my parents' background. So my mom was a dancer, owned her own business, and ran a dance studio for 35 years, but she was a prima ballerina back in her days. And so I grew up a dancer with a dancer's mindset, which we'll get to on many levels. I never really understood how that affected me in my corporate life. My dad's an engineer. And I would say that when I think about my background, I went to liberal arts undergrad. I was originally a chemistry major, switched into business and economics, was minoring in econ, and passionate about economically what fuels and what drives and the whys behind everything. And Af and I can talk about, I just have this passion for how we ROI things, but in the maybe wrong ways to drive transformation and disruption, things like that. And I ended up just cutting my teeth in public accounting. So I kind of like a decade and now about a half. So about a decade doing very traditional finance transformation, public accounting, consulting, auditing, kind of like you name it in that spectrum. And then about a decade rotating through different corporate cultures is what I would describe. A real sense of kind of magnetically drawn to adrenaline and change before we were using words like transformation and digital, right? Like I would call it, I thought it was just like easily bored, maybe. So I did a kind of a rotation through Home Depot, ING, Voya, which is, I did a stint at a couple small boutique like insurance companies. And then I spent a decade at actually Munich Re, which we can talk about, a German-based reinsurance company. And then that 5 years that I kind of carve off on the side, that kind of half a decade, I spent really applying all that acumen of ops, of finance, of systems, of strategy, of relentless pursuit of bucking the status quo into what I would call is transformation, strategy, innovation. But how do you actually feel that to put points on the board? So that's just a little bit about me. I'm at Farmers now, driving their finances, but also the transformation of our business.
Let me ask you about that to start with. So I haven't heard as often Chief Strategic Financial Officer. And can you help me clarify, how is that different than a Chief Financial Officer? Because usually my experience as a CFO is a strategic position where they're really looking at a higher level of guiding, forecasting, guiding where things are moving toward, new market trends. How is your role, would you say, different than a typical CFO?
Yeah. So I mean, it's a little hard because my upbringing and I kind of like what you think you want to be when you grow up was like, you want to be a partner in public accounting or the CFO. And quite early on in my career, I was like, well, I don't want to be either of those things. Because back in those days, that wasn't what I aspired to be, because it was really, in essence, yes, the strategy, yes, the forecasting, yes, sitting at the right hand of the CEO, but it was about the numbers, not about the compelling, like, how do we reinvent our business? Those discussions were like happening. And then it was like, how do I pay for it? Well, no, like, why am I not helping you reinvent it, right? And so in a lot of discussions now, we talk modernization and finance modernization. I actually say, like, why do we even label the vertical? Why don't we lateralize it and say transformation and strategy? Because we all at this C-suite level should be stewards of our total comprehensive business model. And I guess, Rick, it may be because also, so what's different is I spent like the last 5 years of my career working for the global CIO, working for the enterprise architect, being the COO, retiring all mainframe systems, going totally to the cloud. I call it like immersion in the trenches of technology, but to apply it to everything and connecting all that way to ops and finance. And so the strategy CFO, the strategic CFO role is one where we say, we don't get a get out card. We don't get we just have to modernize or be strategic with our function. I'm coming to the table saying, how are we going to actually modernize our industry, our business model? What are we going to do that is an outlier even against our competitors? Because by the way, I don't think competitors are the disruptor. I think the disruptor is the consumer. So what is it that the consumer can envision, and how do we get there? I'll say my economic value proposition to my company is, how do I enhance that value? And yes, by the way, how do I help fund it? Right?
With you. Lisa, you still there? I think your screen's frozen. Are you back? Is it on my end?
No, it looked like she froze for a moment. I think she's back though. Yep, she's there. Yep, cool.
Excellent. I want to get right into it, and go into the title of this session and the conversations we've had in the past. And I think for a lot of the listeners and folks who are going to join this session now or on the replay, we want to talk about leaders and courage, and the courage to do things that they should be doing but haven't quite managed to. And we're trying to work out what stops a leader from enacting. So when you talk about your career, you talk about all the jobs you've done and the diversity of experience. And then you talk about, and by the way, I must say it, because this is Straight Talk Live, we don't see many women CFOs, of course, and we certainly don't see we don't see the diversity of thought at a CFO level. And we often don't think of the CFO as the individual who's going to be this transformational, easy to get along with person. We typecast them, right or wrong, as the numbers people and say, well, don't bother going to the CFO because all he or she cares about is saving money and not giving you any money. And I think when you're changing things, and I think you're referring to what we call systems thinking, right? Where you're a systems thinker, you're in technology, you're in the operations, you're in the finance, you're in the strategy, and so on and so forth. So first tell us, as part of your personal experience, this is your journey, what did it take you to find the courage to do what you're doing today? Why did you just keep skipping company to company? Why did you bother going out from finance to do the immersion in technology? Well, why? We're trying to understand the DNA. And then I think we'll circle back then.
Yeah. So, I mean, so let's really peel back that onion, right? Yeah. I would say that when I was in my early 30s, I actually went to an executive coach and I said, like, what's wrong with me? So I would say, like, the first thing about courage is, like, you have to kind of, like, acknowledge, like, you have to first of all see it. And secondly, I won't say that it was actually, it was part of my DNA that I had to learn why was I differentiated. And we'll get to, like, an outlier on the inside, because there's actually a sense of isolation that's created with people who think like this, pattern recognizers, catalysts, immersion, because it comes as kind of like, why are you my turf, et cetera. So we could talk about the courage about that, because that's, like, kind of like on a whole different plane and different level. But I would say that the first thing is, I think we are often educated, or at least I was, for sure, about curiosity and the why. And we could talk about the why in the digital world. And that's really, in my mind, what's lacking true harnessing of economic output and value in our digital world so far. We can do a lot, but we don't know how to apply it. What's the why? What's the big question we're trying to answer? So if I step back, the courage in all this is understanding and leaning into curiosity. And curiosity beside, over and above your job duty, your job title, and the descriptive roles, right? We in society, you know this better than I do even, we've created, all organizations, not even insurance, this is one area where insurance is not actually the outlier, all organizations were created by an industrial revolution business model. And we created stability and governance and hyper verticalization, right? So I think the first thing when you're entering into these things and you're a naturally curious person and you're trained, I was trained in liberal arts, right? Like, it's less about what you know than it is, like, how to think. Right. Thinking is the golden nugget. And I would say the courage to think, which sounds literally absurd to say, is what has been my linchpin, or my golden rule. If anyone is telling you not to think, and anyone is shutting down your curiosity, that is fundamentally a red flag. Curiosity itself should be not stifled. It should not be diluted. Curiosity is how we better ourselves. And I think a lot of the frameworks, which is interesting that you meant it, like systems thinking and all these things, right? And you're going to think it's funny. I'm actually a little bit of an anti-framework person, because what frameworks have enabled most people to do is stifle individuality, curiosity, and it's this excuse of, I'm following XYZ methodology, or I'm following this roadmap, or I'm following this. And so I would say, like, okay, so first of all, it's like, do you have the DNA? And I think, honestly, Rick and I just had the DNA for it. I don't think it was special. I think maybe the difference was I couldn't stifle, or I couldn't, I couldn't, like, put that on simmer. That DNA was so strong in me that I had to. And then I'd say the courage became when I started hitting all these walls, which you naturally hit, right? Because I'm blindly walking in and I don't have this genetic marker and DNA that most people have, which is stay in your lane, play the game, don't ask the questions that lead to discovery, blah, blah, blah. That's when I had to learn how do you architect your curiosity, right? And that's a totally different game, especially being a woman. And especially being a woman growing up in the industry and the verticals that I grew up in, right?
So Lisa, this is important. Let's double click on that right there, because I know how many people have great thoughts and sometimes try to speak it, and then it just falls on deaf ears, or they don't want to hear it, or there's the whole politics, especially in the corporate space. And I think we've all had that experience in some way, shape, or form, where there's not a place to land, or there's not even a curiosity on the other side to listen. Right. And so here's my question for you is what have you learned on how to tell your story in a way that people can hear? How have you learned when you have met resistance or there wasn't an opening and you just had this intuition that you had to speak that thought that was bubbling up in you? What are some tips and practices or tools of the trade that you could give our audience on what do you do when you're getting met with that resistance and you want to be like water, as Bruce Lee would say, and finding your way around the wall? What are some ways that you've done that or examples?
Yeah, so a lot comes to mind when you ask that question. And so I'm going to answer it in kind of a couple of different dimensions, because I think it depends on maybe who you are in the audience as to how this would relate to you. So I'd say, first of all, connecting back to courage, if you're someone that is, and by the way, my daughter's an introvert. So if you're introverted or you are somebody who doesn't necessarily have the courage to have that voice to walk in and say, it doesn't matter, I'm doubling down on this because it's fiduciarily the right thing to do. Some people are literally just wired that way. Okay. And if you're not wired that way, first of all, I want you to understand that is 1,000% acceptable. You don't have to become something you're not. In fact, that's the whole problem with corporate structures, okay? And the way we kind of condition people. So if you're not that person, the first advice I would give you, Rick, is you need to find that person. And I call it amplifying the voice. So if you have something that's curious, you're not being heard or you want to be heard, and you're not naturally someone who's like Khaleesi, mother of dragons, I'm going to break chains, right? Find the chain breaker and align with them, because a chain breaker is always going to be receptive to hearing points of dissent, points of concern, because they're naturally curious. So they have less, I'll call it cognitive bias, than someone who is less like that. I would say if you're on the, maybe a little bit more on the chain breaker side, and I'm just making these acronyms up because I'm trying not to tie into any specific management framework. If you're on the chain breaker side, I would say, be careful and cognizant of how you create your visual maps. And somebody said this advice to me, and it's probably one of the best nuggets of advice I ever received. Talk outcomes, not ideas. Most people who are naturally curious are ideation people, and we can be, and we think out loud.
That's good.
And we move hyperly, and I learned this in this catalyst session I was in, we move hyperly, like rapid pace, like, quantum, from ideation to manifestation. And most people that we're talking to, if you're this type of person, it takes them time to even understand like what Technicolor is when they're in a black and white world, right? Visual mapping, breadcrumbing, bringing people along. But I would say that you've got to really have an understanding of who you're trying to convince, compel. And we think of things like relationship blueprinting, understanding people's motivation, etc. We are all motivated by the commitments we are accountable for. So outcomes, not ideas. Some of the ideation needs to happen, I'll call it a little bit behind the scenes, because not everyone can actually digest what you have to offer. So those are kind of like on two high level spectrums. I think there's a lot of, I'll call it tips, tools, and tricks in between. But those would be my kind of at least initial two lenses on that question.
That's powerful.
I like it.
I can relate to that a lot. I mean, I think the other parts of this are really nicely put. The piece of curiosity. I just wanted to say one more thing, actually, because you said conditioning. Be careful of conditioning. But I think I would side with the thought that, or the statement that you should condition people to be curious. Because I think when you have little children, and one of the things I'm discovering is kids are very curious. They're born curious. They're born to imagine. They're born with fantasies, right? They've got their own AR, VR world. And as you grow up, you stifle that, you suck it out of them, and you become frameworkized or systemized, if you want to put it that way. So I do think that there's an opportunity for executives to understand that we do have to condition people to think out of the box and be curious. And I think a lot of companies don't allow you to be curious because you have to stay in your lane, as you put it. Right? Stay the course, because of course we're silos and we've got to deliver on finance or deliver on sales or deliver on product. How dare you jump into another lane? And that brings me to the question of culture. So it seems like you've jumped around a lot. So you've gone from big company, small company, super big company, and your roles augmented to a large degree. How did you deal with different cultures? Tell us about failures, if you wouldn't mind, as well, if that's okay. Not just the successes, because of course you're super successful, but you can only be successful by screwing up a lot. You don't learn anything from successes, as in we don't learn anything from successes. So talk to us about a situation where it all sort of fell apart without naming names, because there are people who are thinking, well, oh my God, it seems like everything's perfect for Lisa. Like she just did this and she's curious and she just moves up the ladder and gets a new job. There's got to be some screw up there as well. Talk us through the pain point.
Yeah, the proverbial, let's just start by saying the higher up the ladder you go, you miss one step and you fall down really bad.
Yeah.
As a child, so I'll tell you the story. I actually hate heights, and I literally hate slides, because I guess this is kind of a visual kind of anecdote to my life. I was like 18 months old. I walked early, all this stuff, climbed up this huge slide, got to the top and realized I was scared to actually go down the slide. Like, I guess my fear of heights kicked in. And my mom tells the story as I looked back at her. She was sitting on a bench back when parents took their kids to the park, you know. I looked back, I missed a step, and I fell straight to the bottom, not down the slide part. So I was afraid of sliding down, and I went down clearly the climbing part. And I, scraped my chin, my nose, the whole thing. And I often think of that. I don't know why that story just resonates with me in my professional career, because we have this view of it's so easy at the top. I want to talk about isolation, and I also want to talk about inclusion as well as in this kind of thought process. But we often have this view that we look at people and we think, well, they've made it to this level, or they're so confident, or they're so courageous, or they had a DNA that I didn't have, and that's why I didn't get there. Or I don't want to say it's like so easy for them, right? But I think along the way, I can literally tell you at every level that I got to, every new level of promotion or progression or whatever, I had that slide moment where I got there. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm afraid of heights. Like, I'm afraid of this. Like, yes, I earned it. I deserved it. I worked for it. Blah, blah, blah. And then you look down and you're like, now I'm actually afraid of heights. What am I doing? And if you look back, you skip the step. So if you skip the step on your climb back down, you fall, and you fall faster and harder, right? Because it's combined with this sense of isolation. So, I mean, like, specific anecdotes here are, you underestimate the political environment. You underestimate people. I call it you're sniped. You literally underestimate. You're doing all the right things, and you think you're including all the right people, and you're doing the relationship blueprinting, and you're winning engagement and collaboration and all this, that, and the other. You're doing all the things you're trained as a leader to do. And you don't realize that there's a sniper, i.e. somebody in your organization that's got up on some rooftop somewhere that's gunning for you, because you don't even see it coming, right? And I think that definitely happens. And this gets back to your question on courage. The perspective is, most people, I would say not are paranoid, but most leaders get a sense of that very quickly. And so the question becomes, are you someone who says, I just know there's snipers out there. I'm going to put on a bulletproof vest, or I'm going to run, or I'm going to have like a strategy of, like if you play laser tag, where am I going to go for cover? Or are you going to literally just walk out and say, go for it, because I'm going to get to the finish line before you can get me? Or are you going to say, well, I've got to get in a position of safety? And that position of safety, whether that's emotional safety and political safety is what I'm talking about here, is that position of safety going to put more points on the board fiduciarily for my company and the mission, which gets to purpose? Are you mission purpose driven, or or are you like trying to are you safety driven? What's your like values? And like when I do those value surveys, or whatever, all those different things, I score very high on strategy, fiduciary, and purpose and uniqueness. So when I take those kind of simulations, right, that would always, like, you come down to like a couple of principles that say, this is what I go to the mat on. These are things that matter to me. Mine is always the combination of those, right? So it's a combination of, meaning in essence, I'll be an accountant. My cost benefit analysis in those situations is always coming back to, uniqueness, fiduciary duty, driving the company forward over and above, if you will, that position of maybe political safety. Does that make sense? But you've got to be safe enough that you can actually achieve something to put points on the board.
Yeah.
So, quick question: when you go to CFO events, loads of these CFO events, tell me what happens there, because I'd love to be
A fly on the wall.
Fly on the
Well,
wall.
the best CFO event I ever went to was actually at the New York Stock Exchange, and we were having dinner. So we had cocktails on the New York Stock Exchange floor, which was pretty cool, because I'm thinking
That's
this
cool.
is like all the trades that have occurred. Now it's like antiquated and relic. They don't really do trades there per se anymore, right? But we got to meet the head of the New York Stock Exchange, and then we went and had a dinner in the boardroom of the New York Stock Exchange, and I was just lucky. The table I was sitting at, like the CFO of Facebook was there. And, I was giving him a hard time about nobody using Facebook directly anymore for and then he's like, oh, we've got Instagram now. And we were kind of just jeering with each other. But I would say the most discussions are predominantly about, I'll call it fiscal responsibility, modernizing the back end, leading into how can we become the right hand of the CEO. But I'll tell you a little, I don't know how many people know this. I think almost all CFOs really have a desire to lead and be CEOs. I think many of them, I kind of wonder if I think many of them could lean into running a business. Maybe they just don't think that they would be. And I know there's actually a great example of that. A woman I work for 2 lines down at Home Depot, Carol Tomei, is now the CEO at UPS. So I've always thought CFOs want to become CEOs because we do have a business mind. And we do understand, you understand a lot about how to run a business when you know the numbers inside out, right? Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it did. And I asked the question, it was deliberate because, of course, you're an outlier, and especially as a CFO. It always intrigues me as to what would the CFO generally have a conversation about, and which you've just confirmed, and how do you fit into the puzzle? Because I still feel you're an outlier. Rick wanted to ask you a question, but I had another one around safety. But Rick, you go first.
Yeah. So I want to come back to culture. And that's something that we really hit hard last time with Jonathan Raymond from Refound, talking about the core of a culture is people development, not just shareholder value. And that we're really seeing that shift. And all of us agreed that we're feeling that shift in the corporate space, that what has been the holy grail of the past, which is still true, of having fiduciary responsibility for shareholders and all those things. But there's this growing sense of meaning and purpose, where employees want to feel engaged. They want to feel that their creativity and curiosity is honored, and there's a place for them, their voice, to be heard, or they're going to a different company, right? And so we're seeing this cultural shift happen even within executive teams that I work with and coach. I'm seeing a whole range of those that are more risk takers and those that are more entrenched in the traditional ways of how we do business. So from a strategic perspective, how do you create a space in the cultures you work in or the executive teams you work as part of or with? How do you create a strategic space that really does help them open to new ideas and innovation versus doubling down on what's familiar because it's familiar? How do you work with that on an executive team, for example?
Yeah. I mean, it's such a great question. And I would say it's funny because I think everyone uses the word culture and change management, and it all takes time, and we start by behaviors and then we ripple this down, and we've all heard it before, we've all done it before, we've all engaged in this before, and I tend to be a very I'll say patience is probably not my strong suit. So I hear all these things, I'm like, yeah, but I got to get some, I've got to deliver. The consumer is no longer patient. So how do I do all this and deliver to the consumer? Your purpose is to compel and invigorate and ignite the consumer, right? Whatever you're doing, it might be for, in our case, is to protect their lives and to add, whatever it is, right? Amazon is delighting you, hopefully, right? Hopefully around Christmas, they're getting the shipping back on track. But anyway, that all being said, when I think about this, I heard it, a great analogy to this recently, and it's the concept of the human anatomy in our brains and how we're really wired, right? So there's two vortexes that I would say we all operate in, Rick. And the problem is, I would say our corporate culture, our C-suite, these executive realms, we far too often hit on survival. And that is a problem. That is the number one reason why these initiatives we pursue fail. And people blame it on culture, on time, on change management, et cetera. But if you kind of step back, it's that humans have been conditioned for centuries, right? Like to understand if threatened, our survival mode kicks in, and it creates all of the things that we see permeating. It's fight or flight. It creates stress. It creates anxiety. It creates lack of engagement. It creates low morale. It creates lack of inclusion. All these things, and it very much creates, almost like that example I was giving with a sniper. It creates a sense of, I need emotional and physical and political safety. Therefore, I'm going to go under the radar, right? Because we as humans can actually, no matter how hard we try, we cannot counteract that instinct of, if we're threatened, we go into survival mode, which is the result of this, which is what we see when we try to do large scale hyper, or even I'll call it, limited transformation. However, on the very next side of that, there's this wonderful thing that I think maybe has been what's given me the courage. I don't know. And it's called thriving. And survival and thriving are just like almost like incrementally separated in our brain. And thriving creates if you think about it like this, your body, your brain, and your engagement can sustain when you're thriving at marathon levels of hyper change. It creates it, and it's rooted in curiosity. It creates this circle, this pattern of almost like a natural electrolyte. Engagement and invigoration, and yeah, you're changing, but you're not activating that stressor, so you're not stressed. So it's adrenaline, but in a non-stressful way. So you can sustain that and continue to sustain that, and it creates reward. It creates constant engagement. It creates invigoration, and it's self-fueling, meaning you don't have to continually feed it, because it is being fed continually by curiosity, by the engagement. And so it's a natural receptor in your chemical makeup that creates this pattern of continual engagement, feeling of inclusion, and therefore you actually, it's not change. It doesn't throw you into this survival fight or flight mode. It really puts you into this almost like leaning into it. And then you almost crave it. It's almost like insatiable, like me on sugar, but it's like, I can't get enough of it. Right. It's all the good things for your body. And I think that when I think of like the leadership teams that I've been, fortunate enough to be part of over the years, when it worked, and by the way, it didn't always work. A lot of times it's survival, it's politics, it's all the things that you think of. So I don't want you to think like, where's she work? Let me go sign up. If I say the times where I would feel like included or enabled, or you might use the word empowered, or that's the best time of my life. I love that boss. I want to recreate that team, right? That team was operating in that thriving mode.
Was that before you, after you, during? Because there's an element of the longevity of that. So do you inherit a thriving team, or do you go build one from scratch? Or both, I guess.
I say that I personally have never inherited a team that's operating in that thriving mode, likely because of the conditions put forth. But there's, I'll call it an awakening of the that thriving instinct and capacity, and understanding how to awaken it and how to create it. And then the kind of what other thing I want to draw a correlation to. So I've hopefully created that more times than I haven't. You never know. You can ask the people that work for me. The objective is to create that both at the leadership level and all the teams, right? That's not just something that persists at the leadership level. Every team should have that thrival. Like, what are we doing to thrive, right? And I guess the other thing I wanted to it kind of connects back to your question about the, how you go up the ladder, this tier on culture. And a great colleague of mine who leads a lot of strategy and development at Oracle, she was leading this session and she was talking about isolation and the feeling of inclusion. And the one thing that I think a lot of maybe catalyst, innovation, strategy, transformation, like whatever you label it, right? What a lot of us outliers, our job is to actually create inclusion or this feeling of thrival. Yet we ourselves we're creating so much of it. It's almost like being a parent, you're giving so much, but yet we ourselves feel like an outlier in our own environment. So that feeling of inclusion and hopefully we're creating it, maybe not always, but hopefully the majority of the times we are able to create that, at least in pods or groups. But how do you create inclusion at that higher level, which you'll hear a lot of executives talk about feelings of isolation. Like, who do I talk to now? Who relates to me now? And it's coming back to this thriving concept. Like, how do I thrive? And what do I really do at that level? And so I don't know if that answered your question, but.
I mean, I want to just follow on another point. So when you talk about thriving, you talk about the two vortexes. It's a good way of framing it, I guess. The current situation with world is that you have these three kind of categories of companies. I think you and I have talked about this, that I refer to as dwindlers, Darwins, or disruptors. I think of it as a pyramid, right? There are loads of dwindlers who are dying out, and whether it's pandemic or whatever the reason may be, they're not going to be around in 5 to 10 years. And then the Darwins who wake up and smell the coffee and they want to change, and the disruptors, and we know who they are. Now, if you think of leadership and you think about why things just don't change, it could be politics, inertia, a lot of the factors, lack of accountability. But one thing you touched on, which is very important, is this concept of sort of fear and safety. And even if how many times have we seen a leader go into an organization fresh and ready, first 100 days, come on, I'm going to make this happen. And then, a year later, that person is like resigned to the fact that, I'm not going to make any change happen, but I get paid a good salary, may as well just shut up and put up with it. And they go into the safety mode, but they're still aspirational. They still, deep down, if they detach themselves from their sort of financial commitments, and I've got to pay for high school for my kids, and just the partner or the husband or wife saying, just keep quiet, will you? Just carry on and just keep the job, will you? This time. And I think with a lot of outliers, maybe I'm speaking for myself, but where I'm going with this. A lot of us outliers, we break things a lot, and we cannot tolerate status quo. We just cannot. We're not being difficult, and what's happening in big organizations today is that we're trying to move people away from safety, or getting worried about getting fired, to this new culture. Every time you listen to an earnings call of a big company, including the ones you've been part of, the CEO says, right, we're a digital company, right? Everyone's digital talent, digital this, digital that, diversity and inclusion, ESG, and the whole shebang. So if you had a Harry Potter moment, and Harry Potter moments are, I refer that back to one of our other guest speakers, Martin Ectors. He calls it the sort of Harry Potter problems, but I'm giving you the Harry Potter moment, the wand. What is it that we really need? Cut all the bullshit out. What do we really need to do seriously to get a big company and leadership to think the way you're thinking, to say the things you're saying, and execute the way you believe we should be executing? What should we do?
Yeah, that's it. Like if I had my wand and I had the spell, Hermione, I knew all the spells in the spell book.
Yeah.
That I think that okay, so let me start with the kind of problems, because I like to recognize patterns and then figure out how to play chess in a different way, right? Mm-hmm. So no matter how purposeful we want to be, we have to demonstrate to the street our economic value, right? Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, we have these huge governance, functional, matrix, vertical organizations. And with that comes decision making, et cetera. And, even in innovation, and I'll have to say this before I move on, one of the disservices I think that a lot of people in transformation and innovation, I would like to call it like innovation theater, have done as a disservice, and maybe we should call this like Voldemort in the Harry Potter world, is we've gone into transformation and we've done, I'll call it like, we've taken analog processes to www.com, right? Yeah. And that wasn't really moving the needle. So that's a disservice in the sense of it was a play on economic efficacy or efficiency, or it got some points on the board, low hanging fruit, whatever. I love it. People say focus. Okay, yeah, got to focus. But I did something rudimentary, so let's focus on it. But so if I had to wave my magic wand, it is creating inertia and a sense of continual unrest by the leaders that there is no safety, right? Like the safety is not feeling safe, right? The safety is we continually have to move. And clearly we all talk about these things like there's safety in failing. We're going to be experimental, fail fast, fail quickly, get up, right? But I think if you really study large companies that actually do this well, they actually say if you're not failing X times a year, then you're literally not being curious. You're literally not exploring enough. You're literally not doing these things. And honestly, if it would have to come back to financing, we don't fund most companies to be focused on, like, I'll call it like continual change, continual new thinking. We double down on a model. We say it's great today. How many times have I heard people say, but our margin's really good? Yeah.
Why would we mess with it?
Lack of sense of permanence, right? It's this like, but for the next X years while I'm in charge, my margin's pretty good. Why would I go nuclear?
Yeah.
Whereas I think we need to have a little bit more of, I'll say, the Elon Musk, I'll throw that in there, right? Like, and the nuclear, I was just thinking of SpaceX, but we need to have a little bit more of the, like, I think Bezos is probably like this as well, although I've never talked to him personally. That's never good enough. That's literally, I often say, that's like bread and water on the table when you go to a restaurant. That's not fulfilling. Right. But the problem is the street rewards that, and the street rewards that, I'll call it incremental improvement of that. And so as we kind of connect all this back to my magic wand would be ultimately reinventing, like a spell that reinvented and could pierce through what's really going on in an organization so that the street valued that as opposed to what we're seeing in the financials. And I know that's funny coming from the CFO.
And when you say what's really going on in the organization, what do you mean?
How much, I'll call it, how much continual planning, how out there are they, how forward thinking? Like if we calibrated most organizations against, I'll call it 2020 consumer expectations, and we had a net present value of that, or, we have things like scoring, like NPS scoring and things like that. But like, if you really aggregated that and you signed a monetary stock price value to it, which is like, what's my company actually, not what do I think, not what do analysts think about me, talk about crowdsourcing your market value, right? Yeah. If we really went there and said, I interact with Target and Starbucks and Amazon, let me actually assign them a value, not on their net worth and their assets and their investments, but what about like my consumer experience? If we actually created a consumer expectation and experience, like how you take an IQ score and then you combine that with like how are my kids really doing in school? And it's like, what's their aptitude versus where are they? What's my aptitude? I should get a market value score on my aptitude. Like, where am I? What am I actually doing? What do my customers think? And then clearly you should have that in, I'll call it a triangulation with your actual financials, right? I think that would be a very interesting, like reinventing I'll call it the value system of the way the street, investors, and we look at ourselves. I think there's a lot of that going on, but maybe not in that like clearly defined way that everybody can see it.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to, so this is the 34th, maybe 35th episode we're having here, Lisa. And if I think about every quarter, every month or so, in fact, when we do this, the conversation about organizational models and the way we used to do stuff yesterday always comes up. And I think there is a big movement right now. The fact that we're having this session and this conversation is coming up again and again, it's going back into the core of what the street, what investors, what shareholders, stakeholders, whoever they may be, whatever role they play, value. And I think I do feel hopeful that we're having these conversations because diversity and inclusion, ESG, climate, energy, all of these issues, they're not just sort of fads. I don't believe they are fads. I do believe people fundamentally believe that they're fed up of the way we've been doing stuff now. And I do think, I spent a lot of time with all various people from the Valley, from Silicon Valley, who have a certain attitude. It's so clear. You see them, they're like, F this. I'm going to make it happen. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And it's a self-perpetuating culture. Good or bad, it's been a trigger, an enabler in the formation of new companies. But if you look at Europe, you look at other parts of the world, that's not the culture. That's not how we're brought up. And it goes down to, I think what you're telling us today, it's down to a lot of things. I mean, it's your personality. You were born in a certain way. It's to do with the fact that you had these two parents who were doing two very different things. It's to do with the fact that you fell upon and then you created your own sort of destiny to a large extent. And it also goes down to the fact that you probably don't want to take the shit. You're probably like, I can't tolerate boredom. I cannot tolerate mediocrity. I want to do something different. And you're super curious, right? Now, for those of us who kind of resonate with that, jackpot. What about the rest? We don't have to answer the question, but I do think it's a question mark. What about the rest? We have to help the rest too. Because many people are looking at this and saying, well, it's okay for you then, of course, because your brain works in a certain way. But there are many who have been on the linear path for so long, in the safety zone. And the question is, do we say, well, screw you then, tough cookie, mate? No. We've got to find a way to take them along, which is the point you were making earlier on. There's no answer to that, but there are a lot of questions for you, and we have to ask them because otherwise we'll run out of time. So, good timing. Where do we start? Rich,
let's go to one of Bill's questions. And by the way, if you're listening right now, please send in your questions ASAP so we can get them to Lisa in real time. So, Lisa, here's your first question from Bill. He says, thriving cultures are great, but there's always pushback from entrenched opposition. So when do you decide, Lisa, to become this sniper and take someone out rather than just dodge bullets?
Dodgeball is hard, right? I think that clearly probably anybody listening to this or, there's a law of numbers in change and culture transformation, right? It's the law of a third. So a third are always there's a third that you can awaken that are going to be natural champions that are just like, finally, I've had it in my head and I just haven't had the courage or haven't had, I just haven't had anybody to even say it to, whatever. There's a third that are like on the fence, and these are like statistically published. This isn't my opinion on these. And then there's a third that are honestly toxic, like cancerous, and you have to, like, in essence, cut out the cancer. And so I think the question comes into, when do you take action on that known cancer? And I mean, I would ask the question to any of you back, which is, if you were told you had cancer and you were told there was a way to cut it out or radiate it out, you would do it, right? And it's a hard decision. It's not lacking empathy, and it doesn't say that you don't calibrate that decision against many other things. But I would say, for me personally, that's where my fiduciary duty and that kind of really compelling inner drive, and I mean fiduciary, like, am I acting in the best interest of all employees? Am I acting in the best interest of this organization to the entire, like, I would say society, right? Because what we deliver is bigger than us as any individual corporation, like financial services. We are huge pillars of society. So I would say that hopefully your leader or leaders or yourself, whomever you are in this chain, are willing to look deep and easy calls. It's always easy to accolade the top performer or the person that's willing to do that, right? The hardest calls, the things that you really struggle with, are the difficult calls, the calls where you have to make, I'll call it, really informed, hard decisions. And I'll go full circle. When I was back at PwC very early on, like in the late 90s, so like 3 or 4 years of my career, there was this great 360-degree evaluation question that I stick with to this day. It was just a simple survey question. It said, does your leader act the same way with good results as they do bad results? Like, basically, right? And so as a leader, that's always affected me. And I've always said, do I act the same way? Do I take the same level of, I'll call it, ownership and emotional connectivity to that decision, the hard decisions versus the easy ones. And so yeah, you do definitely sometimes have to take hard decisions, which may involve, I'll call it cutting out the cancer as opposed to sniping, but yeah. And I think you just have to be very conscientious. The one thing I would say is we all enter into these things with what I call hyperbole and rumors and excusism. So make sure that when you're thinking through these things, that you're someone who can connect patterns and can separate fact from fiction, and then understand institutional knowledge. Don't underestimate institutional knowledge, but understand how to create the inertia that you need. Hopefully that answered it.
That's great. It actually leads to another question around, also from Bill. Our entire society is clamoring towards safety, and the constant fear-mongering and crisis fabrication engaged in by the politico media complex is the strongest trend in culture today. So how can you expect large corporations to go against this trend rather than descend into a culture of craven compliance?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that whether I expect that, I don't know that we've yet seen enough of it. I think that we're starting to see movement of it. And I think that I'll say the moment of hope, the call to action that I have is, I think that consumers outweigh the inertia of corporates and corporate agendas and even politics. Like we've seen it already, in the US over this year, right? So I think that we have entered a world in hyper consumerism, personalization, and in generically consumer-led competitiveness. Your competitor is not being akin to your like there's safety also in not being the outlier with your competition. I mean, I know that sounds stupid, but it's like, well, they're doing this big compliance thing and they're doing this transformation. So if I do it and it's within plus or minus, depending if it's $200 million project and they're at 225 and I'm at 200, we're in line, let's go. Nobody's going to fire me for that one. So I think the difference now is that the consumer, again, this revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, has inverted the pace and expectations. Everything else trickled down from the monolithic corporation and industrial, like down to the individual. This is inverse. The individuals have, and also, by the way, we've created curiosity and vision. How many of you sit at home thinking, well, what could Alexa do for me today?
Yeah.
And I bet it'll be out there, right? You have this like confidence and it's going to be released by someone. So I think that the consumer and the dimensionality of corporate and corporate structure is going to have this influence because they're ultimately who we have to deliver to, because guess what? They don't buy. Right? Yeah. It's real simple. Like, what's the adage we all learn? Like, talk with your pocketbook or whatever, walk with your pocketbook. Like, right? If you don't buy, there's nothing to sell anymore. And this is where we see, like, to your point, the dwindlers and this, that, and the other. What happened is people stopped buying. And we've seen this actually over the last 20 or 30 years, if you really think about it. Motorola, Nokia, like, right? We've seen this.
Here's another question. This is from Naomi Kolb on Facebook. And she says, I'm curious about Lisa's self-care practices. And I think this is a really good question in terms of anyone who's bringing new ideas and new thoughts, new challenges in a business. It can be exhausting. It's a lot of sometimes pushing the river uphill, it can feel like. So for all of us, what are some of your best self-care practices that keep you reset, fresh, and all those things?
Yeah, so the first thing that's actually a great question, right? Because a lot of people that are wired similarly or doing these sorts of initiatives, we have this, whatever. There's actually a book that a colleague of mine wrote. Is like Move Fast, Break Shit, Burn Out, right? That's actually the title of the book. It's a great book. And the point there is that we all get in these burnouts. So I would say to Naomi, that's a great question, and I appreciate it. The first thing that I had to learn is what gives me energy. And that's very individualized, right? What gives you energy? And then you have to be sacred about what gives you energy. So athletes are notoriously, I'd say, the best at this. What replenishes them? What gives them electrolytes? Like, what is their potassium? And they're really good about ensuring they get it. And I think that a lot of times et cetera. So for me, I guess I would have to say, I know what my energy source is. I know my Gatorade, and I ensure I covet that time. And that time actually is my number one priority. Like, in terms of, my energy sources, I have to plug into those energy sources. And, I'll just like be Straight Talk Live after all. My energy source is not necessarily rest or meditation or sleep. Those things like sleep. Yes, I need sleep, but meditation, I'm like planning while I'm trying to meditate.
Oh, quarterly report done.
Like, calm it down, and I'm like, I'm a thinker, right?
Uh-huh.
And so I had to lean into that. And so for me, I've actually found things like, for me personally, Pilates. I'm a dancer, and Pilates is so form driven that I can't be distracted while I'm doing that. So that's one form of rejuvenation. And then for me, honestly, I saturate up ideation from other people. So that's actually a form of rejuvenation for me that does not deplete me, that actually restores me. But yeah, I'd say find your own, hopefully you're an electric vehicle, and find your own electrolyte charger and understand what that is. If you haven't yet discovered those things, take time to discover those things about yourself.
That's a great new strapline for all of us. What's your Gatorade?
Yeah,
like exactly. Find your Gatorade. Right?
Maybe they'll sponsor Straight Talk Live. Yeah. Find your Gatorade.
Good point there.
That's right. One last question from Greg on our call right now live. He asks, I think one of the challenges of transformation is not being able to measure the success. What is your definition of success, and is there a pattern for success?
Well, I mean, yes, I would say it depends on what you're trying to achieve, right? There's lots of different things with transformation and innovation. There's I think like 10 published like quadrants of it. So I'd say it depends on what you're trying to achieve within that, or all of the above. I mean, for me, given my lens, this is where probably the engineering lens comes out. I think of a lot of transformation and leaders in the space, we create capacity and successes, and the organization just absorbs those. It's like a sponge. It just absorbs back into the abyss, and you're like, wait, what? Where did that go? And you're like, I'm trying to show points on the board, so where did it go? So I would say that I have a loop where when I create it, I take it, and then you have to kind of like, in essence, like Shark Tank, you have to come back and ask for whatever you need. So if it's an ROI play, it's an efficiency play, if it's a speed to market play, like I will literally say, well, then if I got you to market faster, then I want 4% of your sales back to my department for the next 3 years or 10 years or whatever. So I think we need to start treating our internal projects more like entrepreneurial capital. And how do we fund that capital? And then when you're creating transformation, you're actually creating capital. And so then if you want to deploy that capital, you have to come to me and ask for capital. And then I get to somewhat be in charge of you getting that capital. Or there's a group, right? But I think if it goes all to the corporate container, it just becomes, you did all this work, it goes back in the container of complacency. And then you're like, well, I put points on the board, but we didn't really propel or move the organization forward. So I believe a lot in that type of ownership and accountability. And again, I would say success for me is defined as quantum leap advancing my organization with the consumer being the real disruptor or threat in a way that my competitors haven't thought of, but economically with the same tools. That's my high level definition.
Ladies and gentlemen, Lisa Wardlaw, mic drop. That was amazing. Lisa, we got to conclude the show, but thank you so much for your inspiration today. I could definitely, your energy is infectious, and your great ideas that you're connecting and having us think about business in a different way and how we can stand for our department or the company or whatever it is that we're passionate about to change. So where can people find out more about you and your work? Where should they go?
Oh, yeah. So I'm on LinkedIn. It's Lisa-Wardlaw. You can look me up on my email, lisa.wardlaw@gmail.com. You can easily find me.
And do you have any final last words for our audience of 2020?
You know what? I would just say, I always like to leave with a call to action, right? First of all, let's connect, right? My energy is from other people that have this level of energy. And I would say the call to action is, just understand it is possible. There's a quote that I put on my LinkedIn thing a long time ago. I dwell in the art of possibility. So my like ending like a crappy year, and one in which we become more mentally and emotionally and physically resilient than ever. Dwell in the art of the possible. Don't ever let someone tell you it's not possible. It's just the way you strategize through it. And so that's what I lean on.
Brilliant. Powerful note to end on. Thank you so much. Love having you on board. We'd love to have you back. And all the best. Let's stay in touch. And just to remind everyone, we're going to be taking a 2-week break from the show during the holidays, and we'll be kicking back up in January. We want to remind everyone we have launched our Maverick Leaders Program, and people like Lisa and other amazing guests who are bringing Maverick ideas to you in a free education platform. So just go to straighttalk.live/MLP, and you can get all the information for how to get on board for our Maverick Leaders Program, which is really the conversations that are going to prepare you for now and the future in all kinds of different and creative ways. So please check that out. It's free. And then lastly, here's where we're going to start our 2021 on, is the science of consciousness with Tom Campbell, who's a very well-known physicist. He actually used to work at NASA and the military and then in other sectors. He's an author. He's a consciousness expert who proves it in real physical reality and beyond. And so this is going to be a fantastic, interesting conversation. Next January 7th is when we'll be back together. All right. 2021. May it be an incredible year. We need it, guys. We need it. All right. Thank you all. Lisa, you're amazing. Af, you're amazing too. And all of you listening. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lisa. Cracking, and we'll be in touch, and would love to have you back on the show. And 2021 will be a better year for everyone.
May it be so.
Yeah.
All right. Peace. Goodbye, everyone.